Hi everyone. Let's go ahead and take a look at section 7 of chapter 19 here. Now we're going to be taking a look at these cardiac muscle cells. So remember last section we looked at the two major types of cells in the heart. We looked at the nodal cells of the conduction system in the last section. We looked at how their electrical activity is going to work. Now we're going to be taking a look at the cardiac muscle cells. And with the cardiac muscle cells, what we're going to be taking a look at is kind of the same thing, is looking at how the action potential is going to occur, and then of course looking at the contraction as well. So remember that these guys, these cardiac muscle cells, have to have that electrical stimulus in order to contract. So again, that electrical stimulus came from that conduction system that we just looked at. So let's take a look. So there's two major events that are going to occur once the stimulation comes from the conduction system. You're going to have a propagation of that action potential at the sarcolemma. Remember, the sarcolemma is that muscle plasma membrane. And then after that, you are going to have those sarcomeres contract within the cardiac muscle cells. This is very similar to what you saw in skeletal muscle. We'll look at some really small differences, but it's going to be very, very similar, especially once we get into the contraction and relaxation. So first, the cardiac muscle cells of the atria are going to contract, both of them. And then right after that, as soon as the blood moves in, you are going to have the cardiac muscle cells of the ventricles contract. And that's going to come in another section later on. We'll talk about how blood is actually going to move through the heart with the different the different pressure changes that are occurring and things like that. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at these cardiac muscle cells. This picture looks very similar probably to what you saw before in the previous section with some small details. Of course, now we have a cardiac muscle cell. This cardiac muscle cell, look at its resting membrane potential. It's negative 90 millivolts. So that's quite a bit of a difference than the negative 60 millivolts that we saw for the nodal cells. But this is going to be what we saw with skeletal muscle. So, you know, it's fine. It's the same. You still have the leak channels here, the sodium-potassium leak channels. You still have the sodium-potassium pumps that are going to help establish and maintain this resting membrane potential. But now let's take a look at right here and what we are going to see other channels and the plasma membrane. And I'm sure you're thinking, well, those are the exact same ones as well, Ms. Watson. Almost. So let's take a look. You have a fast voltage-gated sodium channel here, and the nodal cells, it was actually a slow voltage-gated sodium channel. A little sneaky, huh? Look at this. You have a slow voltage-gated calcium channel right here. In the nodal cell, it was a fast voltage-gated calcium channel. So if you don't want to burn those differences into your brain, that's fine. We will talk about the importance of this, though, here in a second. You still have that potassium, the voltage-gated potassium channel, though. All right, so let's take a look at our nice little action potential that's going to occur here in the sarcolemma. So we always, remember, start with that depolarization right here. And it's going to be similar to what you see in the skeletal muscle, in that it's going to depend on sodium. Now see how this is different than what we saw in the nodal cells? Remember, nodal cells, once it reached threshold, then depolarization occurred because of calcium channels. So calcium's role here in the cardiac muscle cells are just a tad different. So let's get back to our cardiac muscle cells. Depolarization because of sodium. Now, once it hits this positive 30, you are, oh, I forgot I had these nice little slides. So again, you've got the depolarization right there that is occurring, showing what's happening, that inflow that's occurring. Now let's take a look at this thing that's brand new to us, something called a plateau. So what you have are two channels working here. You have voltage-gated potassium channels, and you have voltage-gated sodium channels, those slow ones. They are opening at the same time. One is moving ions in, the other is moving ions out. So because of that, you don't have a huge change. You don't have this huge drop that you usually get. But this plateau is going to really be key for once we take a look at refractory periods and sustained contraction, something that you don't want in a cardiac muscle. We'll take a look at that here in a second. But the reason why the slow voltage gated is important is because of the fact that you do want this plateau. So you want it to slowly leak out. So once that you have this big out or inflow of calcium, and then that's actually going to stimulate the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release even more calcium. About 80% more calcium is going to flow out from the sarcoplasmic reticulum because of this calcium right here. So it's kind of interesting. And you guys remember what happens with the calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum whenever you talk about it in 2401 with skeletal muscles? Well, if you don't, then we'll talk about it here in a second. After that, then you have that true repolarization that typically occurs with that repolarization. The sodium is going to come out, and then that gets it back down to that resting membrane potential after that. So that is what is showing there, the repolarization, going back down to -90. So this whole propagation of the electrical signal across the plasma membrane, this is called conductivity, specifically when we talk about it here in the cardiac muscle cells. So we're going to talk about this is going to be a key term that we are going to talk about in the last section that we'll discuss over cardiac physiology, and this whole idea of conductivity. So now that we have, the main thing that this electrical event did was to release that calcium, if you remember that from 2401. Because why we need calcium is because we need it to do this. You guys remember that? Binding to troponin, and that is going to be what initiates that whole cross-bridge cycling. Remember, it's going to help get that actin and that myosin together, and then you have the power stroke, and then the myosin head releases and resets. So it goes in and it binds, power stroke, release, cocks back to its original position, and then it does that over and over again. It is going to be that typical cross-bridge cycling that occurs. And so it's very similar to skeletal muscles. Really the only difference is you're going to have the stimulus. You have that calcium that's going to come from the interstitial fluid that goes in and stimulates the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release so much more calcium, and that's going to help with the cross-bridge cycling here. So let's take a look at our calcium levels. What happens with the calcium levels is, well, first of all, these calcium channels are actually going to close at the in repolarization. So that means you have less calcium that's going to go out and stimulate the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release more calcium. And then another thing that happens is that the sarcoplasmic reticulum can reuptake. It will reuptake the calcium. So remember, once you have calcium levels decrease, that's going to allow your skeletal muscles to relax after that. So that is the beauty of the electrical and mechanical events that are happening here at the cardiac muscle cells and how they're actually contracting. So let's go ahead and take a look at some similarities and differences between skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle. Because I did talk about how they're very similar in their cross-bridge cycling. See, look at that. Both are going to be very similar in muscle contraction and relaxation. They both undergo depolarization and repolarization. However, and what causes them are going to be very similar with the sodium and the potassium. But look, remember one thing that the cardiac muscles had was that plateau phase, because you have some sodium, those slow voltage gated sodium channels that are opening up at the same time. They both have a refractory period. We're going to take a look at that here in a second. And they are both going to have a lag time between the action potential and contraction. Let's go ahead and take a look down here at these pictures. So the blue lines represent the action potential here, and then here's the action potential, the blue line. And the red line is going to show the muscle tension. So when you have that depolarization occur, then that is going to eventually cause this muscle contraction. you have this lag time because you have all of that stuff that's happening in between where the calcium has to rush out of the sarcoplasmic reticulum and then it has to bind to the troponin and do all of that stuff. So that's why you have that nice little lag time. So anytime you see this depolarization occurring, it's going to eventually lead to this muscle contraction. And then look at the repolarization. The repolarization is eventually going to lead to a muscle relaxation. So this is all skeletal muscle. Let's go over here and concentrate more on the cardiac muscle. So as we had already seen, there's the depolarization, and then that is going to eventually cause this muscle contraction. So here's that plateau right here, and the importance of this plateau is the fact that it's going to give it this huge absolute refractory period right here. I don't think it mentions it. That's really weird that it doesn't say absolute refractory period. Yeah, it's listed right there, absolute refractory period. Look how tiny the skeletal muscle one is, and look how long, how long the cardiac muscle one is. I mean, if you think about it, the reason why skeletal muscle does not have a long refractory period is because you want to be able to get another stimulus in so you can get this muscle to contract again before it ever relaxes completely. And remember, that leads to a sustained contraction. That's what you want in a skeletal muscle, is you want to get it up to where the muscle is sustained for a longer period of time. You do not want that in cardiac muscle. So that is going to make sure that this contracts and it completely relaxes after that. In the refractory period, you cannot have any stimulus coming in and stimulating this muscle to contract again. So it gives it a really long refractory period, allows it to relax completely, and then it can go in and contract. This is going to make sure that cardiac muscle does not undergo a sustained contraction. Can you imagine if the cardiac muscle is under a sustained contraction or tetany? It would just locked up like this. We need that cardiac muscle to contract, relax. And that's the importance of having that nice absolute refractory period. So now you guys are going to watch another video. And this is going to be a really nice explanation of an ECG or an EKG. You can use them either way. The electrocardiogram, which is going to be how these electrical signals are going to be collected and can be charted on something that most people have seen before, which is going to be down there. So you'll watch that video and it will go through the what does the T wave represent? What does the P wave represent, or charting? And it will relate it to depolarization and repolarization. So remember, the one thing that we talked about with repolarization and depolarization is where's my pen? When depolarization occurs, shortly after that is going to cause the muscle contraction. When repolarization occurs, shortly after that is going to cause the muscle to relax. So the video is also going to kind of go in and talk about how these different parts of the EKG is going to show how the ventricles are in systole, which is when the heart chambers are contracting. Or this is going to represent when the chamber is in diastole. Diastole is going to be when the chamber is relaxed and filling with blood. So it's going to be a nice little video that you guys are going to watch after this, and then we'll come back for the next video. I will appear again and we'll talk about some heart arrhythmias after that. So until next time.